Philippa, one of the assumptions on which the Asian century debate is premised in this country is that at the end of the day, China and America can avoid a catastrophe. That is, the paper is looking at opportunities, and one of the criticisms of the paper is that it's too bullish. It's focused too much on opportunities and doesn't focus enough on the challenges or the downside. So from your perspective, how do you see the future of the relationship between the United States and China? What are the warning signs here? What are the benchmarks?
Well, I think that the US-China relationship has become increasingly confrontational over the course of the last decade. I think, look, when the world economy is doing well and everybody can have a better future, this diminishes conflict and it raises tolerance. And we now reverse this picture because now people don't believe they're going to get rich before they get old. That is true not only in China, but the United States as well. And suddenly conflict comes back onto the landscape. This is exacerbated by some of the policy choices being made. So as I said earlier today, the Chinese view is that America has a long history of paying for debt problems through inflation. And that we fully intend to deal with the current debt problem through an inflationary path, which hurts China not only in that they hold US treasuries, that's the least of their worries. Their great concern is the export of inflation to them. And they will be the first to say that Tiananmen Square happened against the backdrop of 14% inflation. Inflation is not socially easy to manage in any emerging market, but particularly in one that large. So again, their focus now is on how to secure control of supply lines of the critical assets required to keep that economy stable, particularly in light of the fact that they're losing the manufacturing base to the West, particularly the US. And this is why we cannot be surprised when we see more incidents in the South China Sea around energy assets that the Chinese perceive to have immense value. It's also about shipping lanes and their desire to secure greater control over those, because the fact is that the US Navy does stand there as a potential threat. It has the ability to interdict that traffic if the US wanted to. We always say, of course, we would never do that. And the Chinese say, then what are you doing here? And we kind of go, I don't know, we're just here, right? You know, we don't give them a good answer either as to why we have deployed such resources in the region. You know, the Chinese refer to ASEAN as a China containment policy by Washington. Right? And that is one way you could look at it. So generally speaking, I think we have to expect that we are going to have more conflict, more confrontation in a world where we don't have faith so much in the future and where inflation does drive China to be more aggressive about controlling supply lines of assets. And this will happen not only in Southeast Asia, but more globally as well. And we see the Chinese being very active in physical parts of the world way beyond the South China Sea. Just a few days ago, there was an interesting news story about the Chinese trying to take control of a former US military facility in the Azores. You know, this is different parts of the world where they're saying, you know, we need to have a physical base for security in China. That's a very different world than we had 15 years ago.
I mean, whenever we've seen in history a rising new world power, tension is inevitable. There's no question about that. So it's really how effectively the tension is managed. What are the networks for consultation and contact and crisis management between the two sides that will ensure that the rivalry you've talked about, which will intensify, can be contained. So what I'd like to ask you is, how do you rate the possibility of something going wrong and there being a form of armed conflict?
Well, I think, look, when we think about commodities as a potential source of conflict. It doesn't necessarily imply armed military conflict. It can also be the conflict it creates within a state among the citizens. So I think one of the most interesting and troubling events we see on the landscape today is the way in which many Japanese manufacturing facilities have had to shut down their operations in China because of the disputes over the South China Sea, and now Chinese citizens attacking Japanese facilities. So Sharp, Panasonic, major Japanese companies have had to either completely close or close for periods of time their production facilities. Now, how hard is it to imagine that the US and China get into some kind of a dispute and we see that same level of hostility directed towards American production facilities in China? You already have entities like Foxconn where the employees are committing civil unrest acts ranging from suicides to actually physically sabotaging the production line. And that's where we find Apple computers, Dell computers being produced. So could we have an incident that isn't military in nature but nonetheless represents conflict? Absolutely. And let's face it, we are not going to be able to say to the Chinese, I'm terribly sorry, but you're no longer as competitive as you were. You have to learn how to live on less. This billion people are not going to go quietly. We have to help this country figure out how they're going to make a living for these billion citizens. And our failure to do that should surprise us if we get conflict issues. Now, might we have actual military conflict? Well, it's only a month and a half ago, the Secretary of Defense in the United States said that this is a real possibility, given that our naval vessels and their naval vessels are within half a nautical mile of each other in the South China Sea. So yeah, there's a possibility, but hopefully the channels are good. I notice that every time the Chinese say, we are no longer going to hold military exercises with the United States because we're mad about this or that issue, Australia steps in and says, we'll hold joint military exercises with both sides. And I do think that's going to be part of Australia's role, is to manage, be an interlocutor between both sides and to calm the waters when it's required.
John, what's your response to some of those points?
Well, actually, I think that in terms of managing superpower and emerging power relations, there is probably no country on earth that has better experience than the US. I mean, this is an economy, a state that managed its way through the difficult days of the Cold War successfully. I think that there's also a mistake sometimes made in Australian circles to underestimate the level of engagement that takes place between the US and the Chinese administrations at all levels on a continuous basis. Because the Americans know how to do this stuff. They're actually very good at it. Accidents do happen. We know that. Accidents can happen. From time to time you can see that. South China Sea is particularly interesting because actually if you look at all the countries involved, the country with the least experience in dealing with China, the country with the least trade exposure to dealing with China is the country most likely to actually cause an accident, and that's actually the Philippines.